Okay, Emily, I'm happy to have you start. So we want to welcome our first guest speaker, Emily Stein from Safe Roads Alliance, to talk about her program, Kids Speaking Up for Road Safety. And I hope that was the right introduction, but go ahead, Emily. I'll put myself on mute.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again to the Safe Routes to School team for inviting me to speak. I'm really excited to be able to share information about our program. It's actually brand new. We're ready to launch it in a couple schools in this school year. And basically, I know Safe Routes to School is primarily focused on walking and biking to school and getting the kids out and active. That's how we were getting our kids to school before this year when my son insisted on taking the school bus. But part of the reason behind this program is while I was bringing my kids to school, I would see a lot of parents on their phone, distracted while dropping their kids off or picking them up. And this is their most precious cargo in the backseat. So we wanted to make sure that kids were also given tools to be able to speak up for their safety, but to make sure that they were doing it in a respectful and effective way. So Safe Roads Alliance we're a pretty small nonprofit, and our mission is to save lives through better driving. So our job is to reach drivers about the choices they make when behind the wheel. And our primary focus has been distracted driving awareness and prevention. And I'm sure as everybody at this summit is aware, we did pass a hands-free law nearly 2 years ago, but partially because of COVID hitting just 2 weeks before the law was supposed to be fully enacted, it's almost as if, every driver, not every driver, but many drivers have forgotten not only that distracted driving is incredibly dangerous, but there is a law to prevent you from holding the phone in your hand and hopefully reduce some of that distraction. So often adults aren't listening to PSAs or government messages about this public safety issue, and maybe they're not deterred by the fines or an increase in their insurance premium. But we thought that maybe they'd listen to their kids in the backseat. Maybe they'd start to realize, oh my gosh, what am I doing? My child is watching me. So we designed this program. It's for kids in grades 2 through 6. It is a free program. It consists of a lesson plan, just one lesson plan that we hope could be given once a year. It's 30 to 60 minutes, depending on both the time that the teacher has, as well as the level of engagement that the students have. And it also has about 10 cross-curricular activities. So it could be as small as just that one lesson plan, or as large as a school-wide lesson on distraction and distracted driving. And, we have a poster making competition that the art class could bring in. We have an activity for music, for PE, as well as math and ELA exercises. So we wanted to make sure that this could be a fun and engaging program as well as educational. So this is a slide that I never like sharing, because the really tragic reality is that car crashes are the leading cause of unintentional death for people ages 4 to 24. So this is tragic, and it's also so preventable. We also know that distracted driving is a public health epidemic. We see it on our roads at every hour of the day. We see it in drivers ages 16 up through people in their 60s and 70s. So, we see it on rural roads and urban roads. So it's everywhere, and we need to keep working to try to get to drivers. We do know that parents are driving their children while distracted, and we know that the children are watching. With my own kids, when they both reached the age of 2, they started making comments about my own driving. And I also noticed that they were watching other drivers that we shared the road with. Oops, sorry. So we have 2 goals with this program. The first one is to change the culture of driving across a whole community. If we could get into every 2nd through 6th grade and give them this information, I bet you we could see that as a whole community, you have businesses involved, you have more people aware of what the kids are learning about. And we also believe that we could create a generation of future drivers who are both way more aware of driving safety and way more aware of distracted driving. So just like drunk driving is socially unacceptable today among teenagers and adult drivers, we want to get there with distracted driving. We wanted to make sure that there is a large focus on social emotional learning competencies. So we brought in social emotional learning experts and child psychologists, as well as teachers, to help design this program to make sure that we were doing it in the right way. So we made sure to incorporate the CASTLE framework, as well as include a strong focus on non-confrontational language, most of which you'll hear about in a couple slides. And this is language that kids can use in many different situations. So not only from the backseat of the car, but on the sports fields or in the hallways of school or even at home. And it's bystander language that they teach, as in bullying situations, as well as drunk driving interventions. So Sam is our mascot. So one of the teachers that we consulted with said, okay, we need to have a mascot. And she came up with the idea of a meerkat, because these cute little creatures are actually known to stand up and peep to their community of meerkats as soon as they sense danger. So we thought this is a really good mascot to model this behavior for kids. And one of the teachers actually wrote a children's book, and it's the backstory of Sam. Sam is a child meerkat, and he gets distracted and he tries to do 2 things at once. And his mom keeps coming in to remind him that when you do 2 things at once, you'll make mistakes. So, but then at the end of the book, Sam actually catches his mom doing something not very safe, and he speaks up. So this is actually appropriate for, I'd say, kindergarten through 3rd grade. And I can share the link to the book afterwards. It's just a digital book that we have on YouTube for the moment. So Sam is the one to appear in these videos and lesson plans and teaches the kids about distractions and he models how to speak up. And, we have a lot of distractions around us, whether they're visual or auditory, or, here he's thinking about going to the movies with his cute meerkat friends. So he talks about that in the video that I will play for you now.
Hi there, I'm Sam. I'm a meerkat. Meerkats live in deserts and other dry places without many plants, like this. It doesn't look like there's much going on here, but meerkats need to pay attention. We're small and we're tasty. I have some special skills that help me see and hear and smell everything that's going on around me. And meerkats work together to keep each other safe. We call out whenever we see something that could be a problem. Imagine this. You're riding your bike when suddenly, what's that? A bee? Look out!
Whoa!
I've got this one. Bee. But if you're not a meerkat, that bee might make you panic and even do something dangerous, like swerve into the road. The bee is a distraction. Look out for distractions. A distraction is anything that takes your attention away from what you're doing. Sometimes a distraction comes from outside, like the bee. What's that? It's your sister playing drums while you're trying to watch a movie. That's an annoying distraction. A distraction might be something tempting, like the smell of sizzling bees. I mean bacon, interrupting your homework. A loud lawnmower, a siren going by, the phone ringing, the movie you're gonna see later with friends. All of these can be distractions. Some distractions come from your own thoughts or feelings. You know you should be studying, but what's this? A video game. What happened here? He didn't notice the ball because he was thinking about vacation. Some of us think we're good at multitasking, but doing two things at the same time usually isn't a good idea. Because when you do two things at once, each one is a distraction to the other. Whoops! I make sandwich first, then feed the fish. When you're distracted, you might not finish your work. You might make mistakes.
Hey, Dad, I'm worried that if you don't pay attention, you're going to make a mess.
Oh, thank you, sweetie.
If you're doing something important or risky, distractions can be dangerous.
Whoa.
Almost anything can be a distraction. The important thing is to recognize when you're distracted. Then, you can decide what to do about it. Sometimes, you might decide to stop trying to do two things at once, and just pay attention to the main thing that you're doing. Sometimes, you can walk away from the thing that's distracting you. And sometimes, you might decide to make the distraction go away. You might need to turn off the TV or turn off your phone. You might need to speak up and ask someone to change what they're doing. Or you might... be...
There. Sorry, I think there's a little delay in the video, but that'll give you a sense of what we're trying to teach students. We're not trying to scare them. We're not bringing in any shock factors at all, but just to give them information about how many distractions there are in our world. So Sam the Meerkat is actually an acronym. In the next video, we'll get into this more, but we really wanted to get from the kids how they might feel when someone is driving them while distracted. And Joel, so I should have said that we partnered with Joel Feldman with NDD.org, which is another nonprofit that educates primarily about distracted driving. And he goes across the country and talking to high school kids, middle school kids, and the overwhelming answer when he asks how kids feel when they're in the car with someone driving distracted is worried, scared, and disrespected. So I think, using that knowledge, we know that kids are watching us, and they don't feel safe in a car when someone is not paying attention to the road. So yes. So the second video is a tool for speaking up.
Everyone gets distracted now and then. It's just how our brains work. Sometimes, distractions are just annoying. Sometimes, being distracted can be a problem. Sometimes, being distracted can be a big problem. And, when other people are distracted, that can be a big problem for you too.
Mom!
Oh, sorry.
Being distracted can even be dangerous. The good thing is, we can be aware of when we're distracted. And we can help other people be aware when they're not paying attention too.
Dad, you're not paying attention!
Uh-oh. Yelling is probably not gonna work. Why don't we try that again?
Hey, Dad, I'm worried that if you don't pay attention, you're going to ruin my dinner.
Oh, thank you, sweetie. I should be paying closer attention.
That's an I statement. When you use the word I, you say how you feel. It tells the person what's happening that makes you feel that way. It can be hard to speak up sometimes, especially when someone is doing something that makes you feel uncomfortable, whether you're worried or scared or angry or sad or confused. And it can be hard to remember the best words to use. So, here's something to help you remember what to do. You can use Sam. That's S-A-M. Like me. S stands for see a problem. The problem here is that Dad is looking at his phone instead of paying attention to what's on the stove. A is for address the problem using an I statement. This is where you say something about the distraction.
Hey, Dad, I'm worried that if you don't pay attention, you're going to ruin my dinner.
Finally, M for make an action plan together. Notice I said together? You and the other person can work out a solution. Otherwise, you're just ordering people around.
Here, Dad, let me do something. How can I help?
Why don't you test the pasta?
Perfect.
Sam can come in handy in lots of situations. Maybe you're upset because your friends are arguing. Maybe you're scared because your mom is driving with her eyes on her phone instead of the road. Maybe you're angry because someone said something about you that isn't true. It might be time to speak up. Remember, see a problem. Address the problem with an I statement. Make an action plan together. The next time you want to speak up, remember Sam. That's me.
Okay. So again, the focus is on using I statement, and in the lesson plan, we talk, we give a lot of examples for kids to go into smaller groups and write down different I statements that they would use in many different scenarios. If they feel like someone's leaving them out, if they are watching a friend doing something unsafe on their skateboard. We give a couple situations, and then we have them compare using I statements versus you statements. So if I was a passenger in a car saying, "Oh my God, you're the worst driver ever," or "You're scaring me," that brings on a lot of blame. It puts them on the defensive. Where if I said, "I feel really scared when you're using your phone and driving," then that shares how I feel, and it's not blaming the person. So I'm going to just go through the next couple slides pretty quickly. Again, lots of examples that we offer the kids, and it's, we want them to brainstorm, them to come up with their own examples and scenarios where they could practice using these statements. A friend borrowing something and it's returned broken. And these are things that even as adults, we have trouble, with confrontation. And I was talking with a teacher in Methuen who's going to be bringing these lesson plans into their classroom in the next month, I think. And he said, "Oh, we have, in my own home, I have the I statement template on my fridge, just to remind everybody in the house that this is the good way to communicate." And it's also important for kids to feel like they can help solve the problems. They have the power to offer a solution. So that's why we wanted to make sure on focusing on that M, make an action plan together. Because, I think kids can feel pretty helpless when they notice a problem, they might speak up, but then if they can't offer a solution, their hands are tied. So we want to make sure that they know they can offer a solution. So here's the last video that brings it all together.
My teachers are fine. I love Mr. Burke and Mrs. Smith. But the problem is Mr. Burke is a student teacher and she doesn't know how to teach that well yet. So we're still...
Uh-oh. What's this? Mom's phone is a distraction, and distractions make it dangerous.
My teachers right now, they're pretty amazing. We're not getting much homework. Mom! Mom, you're not driving safely.
How about we try that again?
Mom, it scares me when you're driving and looking at your phone at the same time.
What comes next?
Maybe I should send that text for you, Mom.
Or I can. Can I, please? Or can I add an emoji at least?
Sorry, guys, you're right. I should really be watching the road.
I'll text him that you call him when we get to the store.
Can we get chips?
That's how you stay safe with Sam.
There we go. So I just wanted to close with giving you information about how you could bring this program into your school or community if you think it would benefit the students, if you think it would be received well. Again, everything is free. We did work with Volpe Transportation Center, which is based in Cambridge, but they're contracted by NHTSA. And NHTSA approved them evaluating the program. So we worked closely with them to create pre and post surveys, just so we can, get feedback from students, evaluate the effectiveness of this child to parent intervention. And if the school completes the surveys, we are offering gift cards to that classroom. And again, I can send out the link to where to get the materials, but it's just registering on the NDD website, and everything is then provided to you for free. There's a facilitator's guide that can be given to the principal or the superintendent, just to explain more about the program, the reasons why we developed it. I believe there's one more slide. Yeah, and here's my contact information if you have any questions. I am based in Medford, and I'm happy to also come to schools to present. So that's an option too. So feel free to ask any questions or enjoy your lunch.